in the vibrant radiance of the entertainment world, where fame seems invincible and youth becomes a symbol of eternity, a set of tragedies emerged that significantly shattered the public perception regarding the safety of those who live amidst lights and applause. In the midst of that brilliant scenario, a disturbing contradiction emerged. The more admired certain young artists were, the more enigmatic the circumstances of their departure turned out to be. Thus, the shadows began to acquire an unexpected presence, insinuating that some stories had not been fully told. The sudden death of Qiao Renliang, an actor and singer who was ascending forcefully toward the peak of his career, became the epicenter of a series of questions that to this day remain without a definitive answer. The apparent clarity with which his passing was presented failed to dispel the doubts of a deeply affected audience. The initial official reports spoke of a tragedy linked to depression and emotional exhaustion, but various images, comments, and posts that circulated briefly on social media fueled a wave of suspicions that grew with notable speed. Some content was deleted with haste, which intensified the perception that there was an alternative story, a hidden narrative that never fully came to light. Between bewilderment and disbelief, the public wondered if behind that fateful night lay something more complex than a personal drama. The name of Qiao Renliang then acquired a different dimension. He was no longer just the charismatic artist who had conquered stages with his deep voice and luminous presence. He became an enigma whose life and death seemed to form part of a broader puzzle, potentially related to other young talents who had also departed under circumstances difficult to explain. The disturbing succession of coincidences generated an atmosphere of suspicion that crossed borders and eras, inviting a careful examination of the silences, inconsistencies, and loose fragments that surrounded his case. But behind the glamour and the excuses, what mechanisms really drive this crisis? We will analyze every detail, from the initial errors to the irreversible damages, to see how the world of entertainment functions and how an icon is redefined. In this journey, the trajectory of a man who shone intensely, who inspired thousands of followers, and who, nevertheless, fought in silence against an inner weight that few managed to perceive, will be reconstructed. His story reflects not only the human vulnerability hidden behind the perfect image, but also the complex web of interests, silences, and fears that surround the entertainment industry. The starting point of this narrative is situated on the night of September 16th of the year 2016, when an urgent call to the police changed the public perception of the artist's life forever. From that instant, a tireless search for answers began, which, with the passage of time, only became deeper and more bewildering. The story of Qiao Renliang was built, from very early on, upon a singular mixture of discipline, silent vulnerability, and a determination rarely observed in an adolescent. Born into a wealthy family in Shanghai, he grew up in a home where the absence of his father, a ship captain forced to sail for long periods, molded an accelerated maturity in him. His mother became the emotional pillar that maintained the stability of the house, but it was precisely the paternal distance that drove in Qiao an early need for self-mastery and strength. Unlike other children his age, he did not seek refuge in carelessness, but in an iron will to prove that he could support himself. The encounter with coach Yu Menglong marked a before and after in his personal development. She recognized in him exceptional physical potential and an inner temper that did not bend before effort. Under her tutelage, the young man discovered the discipline of the high jump, a sport that demands an intimate alliance between body and mind. Every afternoon, after classes, Qiao remained at the stadium until well into the night, repeating over and over the movements that defined his technique. The falls, the blows, and the marks on his skin were part of the process that he assumed without complaint, convinced that excellence required absolute surrender. But his rise was as rapid as it was surprising. In the year 2003, when he was barely 16 years old, he conquered a national championship that placed him among the young promises of Chinese athletics. The media baptized him as the boy who flew, a nickname that expressed the lightness with which his figure crossed the air. However, behind that emerging brilliance hid the growing pressure. His performance, although admirable, failed to exceed the expectations generated by coaches and federations. He remained at the second level of the national category, an honorable place but insufficient to guarantee a solid future in professional sports. That crossroads was decisive. Instead of persisting on a path that was beginning to close, Qiao chose to reinvent himself. He renounced his sports career and bet on a completely different horizon: art. His stage presence, his serene smile, and his warm voice had already made him an appreciated figure among his peers. It was not a leap into the void, but a transition toward a sensibility that had always inhabited his interior. He entered the Shanghai Electricity Academy, where his musical talent began to unfold with surprising naturalness. There, he formed part of a student band that, under his leadership, won a regional contest. Those performances were the first indication that his identity was not defined by sports, but by the capacity to transmit emotion. The triumph in a television singing contest in the year 2005 consolidated that new trajectory. He was 18 years old and possessed a stage confidence that contrasted with his reserved character away from the spotlights. His voice of deep tones and melancholic nuances captivated the jury and the public. 2 years later, he reached second place in another national contest, which opened the doors of an entertainment company that sought to mold its next star. The signing of the contract was the formal beginning of his life as a professional artist, a world that promised recognition and opportunities, but which also brought with it a level of emotional pressure that over time would leave invisible scars. During those years of vertiginous ascent, few imagined that the intensity of his schedule was beginning to erode his well-being. Outwardly, Qiao was a young man in full command of his energy. He jumped from one stage to another, recorded new musical tracks, and initiated himself in acting with notable dexterity. His first appearance in a low-budget comedy impressed critics and directors, who described him as a performer endowed with an emotional sincerity that transcended the screen. His career advanced with a speed difficult to break, and that speed began to exact a personal price that he accepted in silence. Starting in the year 2010, the first signs of exhaustion became evident. Qiao began to suffer severe episodes of insomnia that lasted for entire days. The nights without rest affected his concentration, his mood, and his ability to sustain the radiant image that the public expected of him. It was then that the medical treatments began, which included drugs to induce sleep and complementary therapies. A photograph published in the year 2012, in which he appeared receiving intravenous serum set off alarms among his followers. Although he tried to downplay it, the tired tone of some posts on social media revealed a silent struggle that intensified with time. His close circle would later confirm that this internal battle was deeper than what was perceived publicly. His parents remembered the nightly calls in which he sought comfort in everyday gestures, such as asking if they had eaten dinner or if they had had a quiet day. Those simple dialogues functioned as emotional anchors that helped him sustain himself when loneliness and pressure began to overwhelm him. His best friend described that, on some occasions, Qiao confessed that several days had passed without sleep, a state that wears down even the strongest minds. The analysis of this period reveals a fundamental core of the conflict that would subsequently lead to the tragedy. His fulminant rise left little room for rest, and the public image he had to maintain did not allow him to show fragility. The young man who had once found firmness in the rigor of sport now faced a different type of demand, more subtle and more corrosive. The inability to fall asleep became a symbol of an emotional tension that was growing without control. The depression, according to the authorities, intensified until it became a critical condition. The question that emerges in the face of these facts is inevitable. Were these symptoms the real origin of what would come next? Or did additional factors exist that still remain hidden? What is your opinion on this? Comment Amen below so we can continue with the unfinished stories. The morning the news of Qiao Renliang's passing reached the media, the public reaction was immediate and deeply emotional. The preliminary information, divulged through a brief statement, described the sudden finding in a residence in Shanghai and mentioned the initial hypothesis of a suicide provoked by severe depression. However, the succinct tone of the statement failed to fulfill its purpose of closing the case. On the contrary, it opened a breach that would soon become an informational avalanche. Digital platforms, accustomed to reacting quickly to any event in the entertainment world, transformed into a stage where the initial surprise gave way to a mixture of pain, bewilderment, and suspicion. In a matter of hours, the artist's name ascended to the first place of national searches, accumulating millions of reads that grew second by second. Social media filled with messages of condolence, but voices also began to emerge that resisted accepting the official explanation. The public that had followed his trajectory, that had seen him smile in concerts and television dramas, perceived an overwhelming contrast between the light he transmitted and the darkness that seemed to envelop his final moments. That contrast fueled the sensation that something in the account did not quite fit. The speed with which rumors, images, and comments circulated surpassed any institutional attempt to control the narrative. The appearance of photographs taken at the scene of the events intensified the bewilderment. Some showed positions of the body that seemed incompatible with the initial description, while others suggested the presence of swelling or bandages that generated diverse interpretations. The elimination of several of these contents, merely minutes after being published, did nothing but deepen the idea that there were sensitive pieces that someone preferred to keep out of public reach. Audiences, far from settling, began to reconstruct the story for themselves through scattered fragments. This collective process, typical of the digital age, turned personal doubts into a social phenomenon of great scope. The reaction of the traditional media was equally accelerated. News portals produced articles and analyses based on contradictory sources, describing versions that varied from a foreseeable suicide to more complex theories. The case ceased to be solely a tragic event and passed to form part of the national debate on the psychological well-being of artists, the management of information, and the responsibility of representation agencies. At this point, the figure of the artist ceased to belong solely to his intimate circle and became a symbol of the structural tension of the entertainment industry. The intensity of the media avalanche reached its highest point when 8 elements considered irregular by distinct groups of users began to circulate. Although each one emerged independently, together they configured a network of doubts that no official statement managed to fully disperse. The first of these elements related to the alleged discrepancy between the time of death and the time of public disclosure. Some users claimed to have received information suggesting that the death had occurred days earlier. The absence of official confirmation left the matter in an ambiguous state that the audience interpreted as a sign of opacity. Another point that generated considerable impact was the perception, in certain images, that one of the artist's arms was missing. The family subsequently clarified that the appearance was due to swelling and the placement of flowers that partially covered the body. However, for a part of the public, the explanation arrived too late. The speed with which sensationalist information disseminates usually exceeds the speed of clarifications. The narrative had already installed itself and, although without solid foundations, contributed to the story turning even more disturbing. Attention was also drawn to doubts about the place where the death occurred. Initially, it was reported that it had happened in his own home, but later some media pointed out the possibility that the passing had taken place in a residence belonging to someone else. This contrast caused some to begin comparing the case with situations of other artists, who, in an equally tragic manner, lost their lives in homes belonging to third parties. The pattern, although probably coincidental, fueled a collective sensation of déjà vu. The presence of a medical vehicle that, according to some witnesses, did not belong to official services was another topic that stimulated speculation. The question as to why an unidentified transport would have intervened in such a delicate situation did not obtain a convincing answer. The audience, already inclined toward mistrust, saw in that detail one more indication of disorder or external intervention. The doubts also extended to the injuries observed on his arms and neck, despite some sources explaining that they could be due to the filming of recent projects or self-injuries typical of the depressive condition. The public did not consider these explanations sufficiently clear. One of the pieces that generated the most controversy was the fact that the artist had purchased a plane ticket for a trip scheduled for the next day. For many, the action seemed incompatible with the idea of an immediate suicide. This detail evoked memories of other cases of public figures who had made future plans before dying suddenly. The comparison reinforced the perception of a disturbing pattern that did not find a satisfactory explanation. The method attributed to the suicide also generated deep debates. It was considered unusual that a person could carry out an act that contradicts the most basic instincts of the human body. The lack of technical details from the authorities left the audience with a doubt that could not be resolved. Finally, the absence of complete medical documents regarding the depression treatment fueled suspicions about the transparency of the process. Although it is habitual for clinical records to remain under confidentiality, the collective logic did not easily accept that the information was not divulged more broadly, especially in a case that had captured so much public attention. In the midst of this informational whirlwind, the emotional climate became tense and polarized. A part of the public demanded respect for the deceased and for his family. Another part demanded more detailed answers. The artist's close friends also found themselves trapped in this dynamic. Figures like Chen Qiaowen, one of his closest friends, received unjustified attacks for not reacting according to the expectations of an audience dominated by collective anxiety. The artist's parents, overwhelmed by the loss, were equally the object of verbal aggressions that demonstrated to what extent public indignation had exceeded the limits of decorum. The media avalanche not only dismantled the family's privacy, but also showed the fragility of the balance between personal pain and absolute exposure. The accumulation of doubts led society to ask if the case contained something more than an individual tragedy. The absence of clarity generated an atmosphere in which institutional silence was interpreted as one more piece of a puzzle whose shape was not yet defined. It was evident that the story could not end there because the questions, far from diluting, grew every day with greater intensity. As the days following the death advanced, the public narrative began to move away from the initial shock to enter a darker terrain where conjectures acquired an unexpected prominence. In the center of this whirlwind emerged a series of rumors that linked Qiao Renliang's last hours with a private event that, according to various unverified sources, would have taken place the night prior to his death. The image of the artist in what appeared to be an intimate celebration began to circulate with insistence. Beside him appeared Wang Xikong, the son of one of the most influential businessmen in the country, and on the table, a cake decorated with messages whose symbolism gave rise to multiple interpretations was observed. Although no one could confirm the exact date of the photograph, its diffusion generated an unease that propagated through the networks with the speed of a spark in a flammable environment. Some users claimed that that gathering had not been a simple meeting between friends, but a meeting charged with complex dynamics around which numerous theories arose. Among them, the idea stood out that the artist might have been subjected to practices destined to recreate extreme emotions for the preparation of a dramatic character. This hypothesis, which arose from old comments in which the actor mentioned the need to study uncommon human behaviors, was reinterpreted under a more sinister light. What at the time had been an observation on the construction of a cinematic role transformed into the basis for speculating about situations that went beyond professional limits. The climate of suspicion reached a peak when episodes related to the artist's personal life were revealed. A previous relationship, marked by emotional tensions and external pressures, was suddenly and publicly re-examined. Old photographs, published without any context, were used to insinuate the existence of affective conflicts that could have intensified his psychological fragility. The audience, already deeply immersed in the search for answers, began to interlace these fragments until building an image that, although disturbing, lacked verifiable confirmation. The absence of official declarations addressing those speculations allowed the parallel narrative to acquire strength of its own. However, the true commotion arose when people began to speak of a pattern that could not be overlooked. Three young artists, also linked to the same representation company, had passed away in equally bewildering circumstances in the years prior to and following Qiao Renliang's case. Their deaths, although officially explained, had left a trail of similar doubts. The concatenation of similar events within the same professional environment awakened fears that went much further than individual tragedy. The case of Mao Xiaotong, a young actress whose sudden passing was announced with a delay by her agency, had given rise to interpretations regarding the way in which certain news could be modulated for reasons unrelated to family grief. The early departure of a singer at her peak, whose last public contact had been a live stream broadcast barely days before her death, also generated doubts about the speed and transparency of the information. Even the fatal fall of another performer, found in a state that deeply impacted the media, would have remained marked by details that were never fully explained. Each of these events was, at the time, considered an isolated tragedy. However, the accumulation of similar circumstances within the same institutional structure provoked a collective shudder. What began as a series of disconnected questions turned suddenly into a possible indication of something deeper. Online conversations began to adopt a different tone, in which the apparent coincidence transformed into organized suspicion. The public wondered if these tragedies shared a common origin, or if it was the unfortunate accumulation of events without relation to each other. Observations about contracts, labor relations, and internal tensions between artists and executives transformed into recurrent elements within the digital debate. Although no version could be sustained with conclusive proof, the collective perception acquired a character of silent warning. The figure of Qiao Renliang, already charged with symbolism by the initial shock of his death, then became the axis of a narrative that exceeded the limits of his own story. His case was perceived as the vertex of a disturbing triangle formed by other names whose careers had also been interrupted by enigmatic circumstances. In this context, every detail that surfaced, however minimal it might be, was interpreted as a possible piece of a puzzle whose image could not yet be fully distinguished. Several discussions in digital forums began to suggest that the succession of young deaths could be related to internal pressures, professional conflicts, or dynamics that were never completely exposed. The silence of the involved parties, added to the succinct statements that avoided deepening into the facts, contributed to the audience feeling that the truth was kept on the margins of public light. Perceptions about power, media control, and emotional vulnerability interlaced in a tale that, although constructed by the collective imagination, reflected the genuine fear of a society increasingly conscious of the shadows that can hide behind fame. The culminating point of this tension arrived when users began to superimpose timelines and compare the last movements of the involved artists. The coincidences, real or imagined, took the form of a warning. Comments pointed out that all of them were at decisive stages of their trajectory, that they enjoyed growing popularity, and that they had important projects in development. This convergence was interpreted as a disturbing sign and added a nuance of fatality to the tale already charged with uncertainty. With the passage of days, the public conversation reached an increasingly somber tone. The audience, trapped between the desire to protect the memory of the deceased and the need to find answers, wondered if those deaths had really been independent events or if they formed part of something greater, a framework whose complexity escaped conventional explanations. The sensation that the truth could be deeper than imagined began to acquire an almost prophetic character. In the midst of this atmosphere charged with doubts, a question emerged with the force of a whisper that froze the blood. What if what is known until now is only the surface of a much greater mystery? The echo of Qiao Renliang's tragedy continues to resonate with depth in the collective memory as a persistent reminder of the fragility that can be hidden behind the splendor of fame. After his departure, the family environment remained wrapped in a painful silence that revealed the intimate dimension of the loss. His parents, who for years had tried to understand and alleviate their son's anxieties, were forced to face not only the grief but also the avalanche of interpretations that questioned every aspect of his life. That exposure, which in other times would have been inconceivable, transformed private pain into a kind of public observatory where everyone seemed to have an opinion on what happened. The emotional impact also extended to his closest friends, who experienced the pressure of giving explanations in front of an audience that claimed, with inexhaustible insistence, an absolute truth. In the midst of that climate, spontaneous tributes multiplied. Fans from different regions sent messages that, although charged with sadness, expressed deep gratitude for the light that the artist had transmitted during the years in which his voice and his presence had accompanied thousands of people. The loss of Qiao was not simply the disappearance of a talent, but the interruption of an emotional connection that had managed to transcend the screens and stages. With the passage of time, the public narrative ceased to focus exclusively on the darkest details of the case to open a broader space for reflection. His story revealed the complexity of emotional balance in the world of entertainment, where constant demand and permanent exposure can silently erode even those who seem to have everything under control. The media attention that surrounded his death highlighted the importance of addressing mental health with seriousness, without stigmas, and without superficial interpretations that reduce the depth of human experiences. The succession of young deaths within the same professional environment introduced a disturbing question about the structural vulnerability of the system. Although no theory managed to consolidate itself as a definitive explanation, the perception that something was not completely clarified invited consideration of the need for more transparent work environments and support networks destined to protect not only careers, but also the lives of those who inhabit those spaces. The combination of pressure, expectations, and prolonged silences proved to be fertile ground for the proliferation of interpretations that, even without conclusive proof, reflected a social fear toward the dark zones of the industry. The story of Qiao Renliang left us a legacy, a lesson that transcends the tragedy. His trajectory illuminates the importance of recognizing that strength does not always show itself in an evident manner, and that a person's inner struggle can remain invisible even to those who are by their side. The complexity of his life and then the ambiguity of the events that surrounded his death offer a reflection on the need to listen, to observe, and to pay attention to the nuances that often go unnoticed in the immediacy of the contemporary world. In that sense, his case invites a reconsideration of the manner in which the public interacts with public figures, remembering that every artist is a human being who faces their own challenges. Compassion, more than speculation, could be the starting point to build a more human environment for those who live under the constant gaze of millions of people. In the end, the question that arose after his departure remains open. Is it possible to fully know the truth behind a life that was lived between lights and shadows? Perhaps the answer remains hidden, like a fragment of mystery that will never be revealed. However, what does remain is the emotional footprint he left and the possibility of learning from his story to build a future in which vulnerability is not a stigma, but an invitation to deep understanding. Time will tell if new investigations or testimonies will allow for more clarity to be shed on the events that marked his final days. Until then, the memory of Qiao Renliang will continue to accompany those who saw in him not only a talented artist, but a life that even in its silence continues to challenge the world.